Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Marc Nutter, the Conservation Programs Director here at New Hampshire Audubon. And I'd like to first acknowledge that this presentation is streaming to you from our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnimbak, or human beings, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. New Hampshire Audubon is honored to continue the stewardship of these lands, providing opportunities for all people to form connections to the natural world through our programs and wildlife sanctuaries around the state. And I invite you to learn more about the Indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting the website native-land.ca. Here you can explore and click on territories of Indigenous people and get connected to resources to learn more. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, check out all the resources available at indigenousnh.com, including this really great interactive story map that details the Indigenous presence and their stories here in New Hampshire. And thanks again for your interest in this evening's topic. You'll see that we're in webinar mode. So again, you probably have been in a million of these things. We're going to use the chat function for any reactions and comments, and really focus on the Q&A button for the questions that you'd like answered by our panelists this evening. And so we've got a great panel. Alina Harris is going to talk about site preparation methods and bee-friendly plants. We have Emma Erler that's going to talk about seeding and native plants and how UNH can be a resource. And we also have Matt Tarr, who's going to talk about invasives through the lens of insects. But before I jump into my brief presentation, I'd like to make sure everyone is aware that New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that's completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 programmatic pillars: connecting people to nature through environmental education experiences like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like these; researching and conserving species in peril, including large raptors and small birds; managing about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation; and finally, advocating for sound environmental policy in the state legislature. I'm able to be here today because of members and donors like you. We also rely on a huge network of volunteers that assist us with virtually everything: wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you're a volunteer, member, or supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, I'd like to sincerely thank you. We simply couldn't achieve our charitable mission without you. If you'd like to become a part of our conservation family today, which I hope you will, please check out our website for ways to get involved. With that, I'm going to jump right in. So for those of you who've been to the McLane Center, our state headquarters here in Concord, you've probably seen that beautiful grassy area. And to give you some context of the project that's going on out there right now, this is co-managed property that belongs to the St. Paul School. And in the past few years, we've allowed it to succeed into early successional habitat for breeding birds. And in 2017, we got some money from the NRCS to develop a pollinator conservation action plan. Then we kind of shifted focus with the help of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a few foundational grants. We built a demonstration pollinator garden right around the building. And then as part of an actual extension of that, we went to moose plate funding in 2019. For obvious reasons that will become clear soon enough, we postponed it in 2020 and used that time to create a pollinator garden virtual tour to bring people to the center and learn about pollinators even from their home computers. And so we are full throttle now here in 2021, and that's what I'll be bringing you up to speed on. So the title of this project is actually Non-Herbicidal Methods to Establish a Demonstration Pollinator Meadow. And this is the photo that I took right before I drove all 9 copies to the state office. We were so happy to get funding for this project through Moose Plate grant program, as well as a few key individual donors. And so if you've been to the center before, it's kind of off screen to the below the screen. And this is that grassy field. And then this is the whole meadow kind of study area. And so the basics of this is we're testing out different site preparation methods to figure out what works best for this condition. So you'll see that the 2 years are separated, and each one of these rectangles represents 1/4 of an acre. So we're focusing on a 1/2 an acre increments, and half of it will be till, and half of it was mowed. And further complicating the experiment, we wanted to figure out, would fabric be better or black plastic? And partly because of supply chain issues, we had to do this separate kind of study. But I think it's a good kind of riff on our project idea to begin with. So to give you an idea of what the site condition was, this is a short video of me walking through the most dense area. You'll see autumn olive, honeysuckle species, common buckthorn, bittersweet, and multiflora rose that was really thick in this area. And so we were like, well, how do we turn this like shrubby woodland into a pollinator meadow? And for that, we just brought in the big guns. So this is a Rayco mower. It's wild. I have a couple of videos of how it works, but if you see right here, it's pretty much a bobcat on steroids with this implement in the front of it. And these are giant knuckles that spin and shred up things, more or less. And so this mower crew was on site for 2 days. They did go beyond the 1 acre study area to do a little bit over 3 acres. It was a little bit of cost involved with it, but we think it's paying off now. And you can see it was actually really light on the sections that we didn't ask him to go too deep, but you'll see that he put the implement a little bit further down into the ground, and you can see here how it shreds up the sticks and branches and twigs. It was pretty loud, but really impressive to see this thing in action. Just eat and tear away and shred the stumps. So I'll show you what the result was in the next slide. And that was the Rayco mower getting pretty close to our old stone wall. And when he couldn't get it all the way to the ground, this is kind of what the result was, these splintered stems. He said that it would like kill it, but time has told us otherwise. But I got a photo later on in the slide deck to show you. But if you remember back on our study plots, one was going to be mowed and the other was tilled. So after we saw that he could go down into the soil, we asked him to pre-till our 2 tilled plots. So this machine could go 4 to 6 inches below the surface of the soil there to really dig up those top roots. It did leave some tracks as per normal, but that was pretty easy to rake over and level out. And so this is just an example of the resulting kind of pre-till area versus how light that machine could impact the non-tilled zones. And just like it was shredding up roots and stuff, there was debris that we needed to pick up. later on with our volunteer crews. And so on Earth Day in April of this year, we had a great crew from UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law to come out to help us level those Rako ruts, remove that debris, removing those woody stems. And big shout out to Matt operating a piece of equipment back here to help us prepare for those sunflowers, that rototiller. So they were raking and having a good time. And we even were able to find the shredded stump heads and really pull them out of the ground with this volunteer effort because the vegetation was so low. So again, we're here in this area, just focusing on this red block, as well as establishing the sunflower perimeter, because we have nature day camps that go on in this field and some other events. So we were like, we should probably put something in between the public and just the black plastic and denuded landscape. And so in June, we had a great crew after we had a local farmer come in and mow and till those plots. We planted those 800 sunflowers, and then the Student Conservation Association volunteered a crew for a whole day that did all this, and I'll run through this with photos. And so you can see here, this grass was mowed, but not nearly close enough. So we went back with a push mower, but this is the crew that started raking and removing any of that other woody debris. Believe it or not, this was the area that I showed you with the video of the Rako going in. And so this was the pre-tilled area, and we decided to kind of cover crop some of these bare areas with seed in June. So this is just a photo of that tilled area, not too much vegetation left there. Here's Phil Brown, Director of Land Management here, operating that push mower that we then had to rake and mow and rake and back and forth. But this was the result. The tilled area on the left and the mowed really close area with the thatch removed on the right. So again, this is what we're aiming for, fabric and plastic, down this 300-foot long stretch of meadow. And it took a lot of figuring and math, and was like, okay, well, how many do we need to equate to this acreage? But we were able to find 15.5-foot wide rolls by 300 of the landscape fabric. And the largest pieces of plastic we found were 40 by 100. And so this crew made really quick work of it, unrolling these tarps. And as soon as the first one was unrolled, we had a crew that was using these six-inch long staples that were weighing it down. And then pretty soon we were ready to roll out the plastic. And you see this crew over here with a bunch of old railroad ties that we had lying around in our back parking lot. So we were actually testing another thing between these 6-inch staples and the railroad ties. The railroad ties worked really well. I have a picture showing that the staples didn't work very well. We also put signage around the perimeter. Shout out to Amy Papanow, who thankfully let us reuse the sign that she made for another project. But we didn't want to reinvent the wheel when Amy made something so perfect, explaining what was happening there. So shout out to Amy. And as you can see, it's not exactly perfect, but things in the field rarely are. So we were okay with that because we got the acreage that we were aiming for. So again, big shout out to this SCA crew that did all this work in just a matter of a day. Throughout the summer, this is a hilarious photo, that this is a tarp that is blowing up. So it was a lot of work just to stay on and refiguring how to do these staples. But we also found critters here hanging out in the overturned tarp as we were re-leveling it and weighting it down with more and more rocks. You can't have enough rocks. So we get to October, just 3 weeks ago, I guess. where we were doing preparation for the year 2 plots. So we had to survey that to figure out, well, where do we need to mow and till, and then re-mow. I'll show you a photo of that. And then we were moving those coverings from the year 1 plot over to the year 2 plot, and then seeding those year 1 plots. So here's a photo that's showing you how I know how to use a compass to survey the areas. But the other thing you can see in this photo is this was one of the denser areas of that woody vegetation, and you can see how it just all pretty much came back immediately. So we know that we have a lot more work to do with managing these invasive species. And there's Wayne from just down the road at Rocky Old Farm that helped us out by tilling this area on the left and mowing this area on the right. And just like when we had the Rayco mower there, we asked him to do the whole meadow. So even that woody debris he was able to mow down, and maybe Matt can tell us a little bit later if that was the right thing to do or not. But you can see how there's a lot of thatch on this. And in hindsight, you know, I wish we would have York raked it because it took a lot of effort. So we raked it after the farmer came through, and then we had to mow it at like 6 inches high, and then rake it again, and then mow it on 2 inches high. It was so much raking. I still have scars from the blisters on my hand. But here's Phil again mowing, and then a little bit of a hint of what was underneath the black plastic. These little seedlings were just ready to keep coming up. So I don't know if they're the good ones or the bad ones, or if there is such a thing as good and bad. But the crew persisted, and we decided that, you know, we crossed our fingers and we were like, this thatch is gonna be covered for the next 12 months. You know, we're not gonna uncover it until October of next year. So we're really crossing our fingers that all of this thatch decomposes over those 12 months because we tried to rake it and it was just taking up too much dirt at that point. So we kind of shifted our focus and removed the rest of the thatch off of the covered plots very lightly before seeding, and just kind of move those tarps to the back there. Here's a photo of kind of what was underneath between on the mowed side, because the tilled side was really very much the same. It was tilled, there was no vegetation really. And we were interested in, well, what did the landscape fabric do, which is versus the black plastic. And kind of surprising to me, the soil underneath the black plastic was more moist than the permeable landscape cloth. But I haven't done this before. And it was pointed out to me that's pretty obvious because the landscape cloth allowed it to evaporate, whereas that plastic was a barrier. So the jury's still out if one way or another is better for us. Maybe the experts later on can tell us. We had a visit from Ted Kenzoria from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he was interested in like, well, what was going on underneath the soil? And so I think right here he's in the tilled area, and we found that the tilled versus just the mowed actually had a lot less root mass that was viable. So we're thinking that the tilled section might be better just because of that competition that's still kind of left in the soil. And then we split up, and after almost a whole day of just handling a rake, it was time for everyone to have a little bit of seed, and it was fun to see all these seeds being thrown. A surprisingly small amount of seed. I thought it was going to be a lot more, but we went by the recommendations for our acreage and tossed them out. We all then used a lawn compactor that we rented, filled with water. We had 2 of them going on to really compress that seed right into the soil. And then we threw straw over top of it and then moved the tarps. And huge thanks again to the same SCA crew. I thought it was really cool that they wanted to come back for more after helping us out in the spring and wrapping it up in the fall with us. So key takeaways for me is you got to have volunteers if you're going to do it at this scale in this particular method. That York rake probably would have been nice. Those coverings are a huge investment, but they've held up really well. You'll always be running around in circles chasing your tail if you don't really stake and weight it down properly. And then the three questions, I had that hopefully we can get to later on in the panel is, could we have covered the plots in April instead of waiting to mow it again in June? That might have saved some time. Should we have waited? We were trying to be like really efficient and just move the year 1 plots to the year 2 plots at the same time, but it's not the same as what we did this spring. And then obviously, will those woody invasives just pop right through the coverings? And we'll see, and we'll keep you all updated. So our next steps are just maintaining those coverings, keeping the sun away from that soil. We might need a volunteer effort in the spring. Those year 1 plots, we're going to mow at 8 inches in July to prevent them from going to flower, and we really want them to put their resources into developing those good root systems. We're going to be monitoring, how those plants are establishing themselves, as well as the visiting pollinators to the area. We'll look to another volunteer effort in October of next year for seeding the year 2 plots, and then continuing that annual mowing cycle, suppressing the invasive species and really cultivating this demonstration pollinator meadow. And if you look out a couple more years, we really want to construct a better trail around the perimeter to really get people of all abilities out there to see the magic of a pollinator meadow. And of course, New Hampshire Audubon is known for their educational programs and workshops. And so we really want to continue this pollinator education and using not only the demonstration gardens, but now the demonstration meadow as well. So I'm at my time. If there are any questions for me briefly, I'm happy to answer them. And if not, we will go into our next presentation. How do I see questions?
Mark, you have a couple. Is the RACO available for public rental?
Oh, that's a good question. I would imagine so. It was through Asplin, and it was just, a contractor. So a private citizen could rent that out.
A couple others. What was the purpose of the straw laid atop the seeds? Are you worried about the grasses from the straw outcompeting the sown seeds?
That is a great question, Willa. I'm not really sure why we did it. I think some of it has to do with moisture retention, more so than the competing grass. If any of our panelists have better answers to these, feel free to jump in.
There's one distinction between straw and hay. So for instance, hay is what typically has weed seeds or grass seeds in it, whereas straw is just the stems of more of like a wheat crop or something like that. So if it truly is straw, which it looked like it was, then it shouldn't have seeds in it. And so, yes, I'm imagining that you were putting that on for more so the moisture, keeping it moist, and also, there are some winds, so those seeds that didn't get fully compacted in there, you can help them stay there rather than blowing away after you spent that money on them.
Thanks, Alina. Yeah, I reread that question. Yeah, it was definitely straw, not hay.
And I actually have a slide on that in my talk in a little bit. This is Emma. Yeah, so all those things, moisture, keeping seed in place. A big thing too is precipitation. When you have bare soil, erosion is very likely. And if you put that straw on top, that's going to help break up those water droplets. They don't hit the soil quite as hard and wash seed.
Awesome. I think I'm going to hold off on these other 2 questions that I see, the seed mix and the purpose of the tarps, because I think we'll get into that a little bit more and circle back.
All right. Can you see my screen here?
Yep. Looking great.
Try and move our faces away here. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. You already kind of heard from me a bit, but my name is Alina, and for those of you who maybe don't know me, I'm an integrated pest and pollinator management specialist with the Xerces Society, and I'm also an NRCS partner biologist. And thank you so much for joining me tonight to learn about pollinators and their close relationship with flowers and how we can support these amazing animals through conservation. And big thanks to New Hampshire Audubon and Diane DeLuca and Marc Nutter for organizing and hosting this webinar tonight. And I wanted to just reiterate that Marc did mention them earlier, but the NRCS stands for Natural Resource Conservation Service. And through this partnership that I have with the NRCS, I provide technical assistance on various pollinator habitat and pest management techniques that are implemented by private landowners and farmers. And with the help of my NRCS colleagues, if a landowner has applied for and been selected for funding, they can receive funding to support their conservation efforts. For example, they can receive an incentive payment towards the establishment of a pollinator meadow similar to the one in this photo. So in the photo, it shows one of our goals, which is to have a minimum of 3 species of bloom, or 3 species blooming at a given period in the season. And this results in a beautiful array of colors, pollen types, nectar types, and pollen species that visit the different plants. So here in that red circle in the foreground, we see some lighter pink monarda with echinacea or coneflower nearby, and what appears to be blue vervain in the background there. If you haven't heard of Xerces, or the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, the nonprofit has been around since 1971, and we work to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And most people are curious about where the Xerces name comes from and what it means. Our namesake is the Xerces blue butterfly, pictured here, which is thought to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human urbanization and loss of habitat. So it's species like this that inspire us to do the important conservation work that we do today, with the aim of preventing more beloved invertebrates from going extinct. The Xerces Society does a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. I personally spend most of my time within the topics of pollinators, conservation, biological control, agricultural biodiversity, and pesticide protection. And then we also have conservation programs for aquatic invertebrates, urban conservation, endangered species, and community science. And you can look for products in the store that have been Be Better certified through the Xerces Society, and consider joining the community of bee cities or bee campuses across the USA. Xerces has a plethora of free resources of plants, pollinators, other insects, and habitat restoration. And I invite you to visit xerces.org to access them and share them with your friends and colleagues. Before we really get into it, I wanted to start up front with acknowledgements. And again, thank the New Hampshire Audubon for hosting this webinar. And as a nonprofit, the Xerces Society also relies on donations from our widespread communities. Special thanks to the NRCS, the Xerces Society members, maybe some of you are in the crowd, and our other supporters that allow us to continue to do on-the-ground conservation work and educational presentations like this one. If you'd like, you can support us too. To promote a wide diversity of pollinators and invertebrates, we recommend a multi-species, season-long bloom to provide nectar and pollen. This is that same concept that I was describing during my first title slide. This is a very simplified diagram to show that we aim to have at least 3 early blooming, 3 mid blooming, and 3 late blooming species included in the mix. This chart shows a mix of naturalized and native species that are both perennial and annual. And you'll note on the bottom of this slide that this chart was adapted from a UNH cooperative extension publication on wildflowers in southern New Hampshire. UNH Professor Emeritus Kathy Neal has done some fabulous research on pollinator meadows, which you'll hear about from Emma Erler with UNH Cooperative Extension just after this presentation. And so within the New Hampshire Audubon webinar series this fall, I gave a longer presentation on pollinator meadows with more details. And Emma gave you one on flowering trees, shrubs, and trees and shrubs for pollinator conservation. So if you haven't already, check those out on the New Hampshire Audubon YouTube channel. But establishing a pollinator meadow isn't as easy as some may think. You heard a little bit about that from Marc. They're doing some big work there. It isn't exactly rocket science, but it is a long-term commitment that requires a lot of steps and attention to detail. So depending on the site, it can be 1 to 2 years of site preparation, and only in year 3 after seeding will it begin to look like these beautiful photos. Since these native seeds are perennial, they take a few years to establish their roots. Some may not flower for a couple of years while they're establishing. It's important to know what to expect because during the site preparation, it can be an eyesore, and even once established, may be too wild looking for some people's aesthetic. For pollinator meadows, we recommend that native grass is part of the mixture, which can be a surprise to some people. Bees like nesting in native bunch grasses, but furthermore, the grasses add structure to the meadow, which physically holds the flowers up from flopping over, as well as helping reduce competition from weeds in the beginning by filling in those gaps. And it can also reduce erosion. I tend to add wild rye and little blue stem. These native grasses are nowhere near as aggressive in our introduced species of grasses, or as our introduced species of grasses that we see covering our landscapes in haylands and lawns. That's why it's so important to fully kill the non-native sod before seeding the native meadows, which leads us to our next slide. You've seen some of this before. Site preparation is a critical part of successfully establishing wildflower meadows. As you've heard from Marc at the New Hampshire Audubon, they tested 4 versions of site preparation. And on the left is that woven tarp, whereas on the right is that thick black plastic. And he also talked about how some was tilled prior to laying it and then some was only mowed and they removed that vegetation. And in their situation, it seemed that, the tilling seemed to work out better for them. And you can see that how we mentioned that railroad ties worked really well to hold down the large tarps that love to blow away in the wind. This farmer used sandbags, which is what I would recommend if someone is purchasing weights to hold down a tarp. Many smaller sandbags can be easier to move using just human power. And a key to maintaining the integrity of tarps used over multiple years in sites is to use weights such as sandbags that are non-abrasive and are less likely to poke holes compared with sharper objects or abrasive cinder blocks. So here's that same farm in August, and you can see the silage tarp really did its job. Kathy Neal's site preparation research at UNH tested the effectiveness of tarping methods and found it was equally reliable as herbicide treatment. For me, if the site is less than a 1/4 acre and the landowner has funding for silage tarp, it seems to be our most dependable option in the Northeast. However, large pieces of this tarp is not necessarily cheap. And in the short time that I have today, I'm only going to touch upon tarping methods for the Northeast, but there are many other options. So please do reach out if you want to explore those. Here's a farm that used a no-till method of tarping. This is on an organic farm on what I would consider a very weedy site with lots of residue. In the spring, we would recommend that you mow the existing vegetation as close to the ground as possible. Next, you want to remove the thatch or existing vegetation, which could be with a York rake or baled up as one would with hay. And next, you're going to lay the tarp over the site with multiple pieces. If you have multiple pieces, you want to overlap it and add lots of sandbags. And then in the summer, you want to check frequently for wind or upheaval or upheaval from the wind or damage from wildlife. And then in the summer, we want to remove the tarp, rake off that terminated residue again. So this is that no-till method. So the raking is super key. Getting stuck here. And then so after it's raked off, which you can see on the right, ideally, if you did this in mid-August, you could lay that tarp back down to just kind of maybe germinate some extra weeds that have been kind of slightly disturbed there. Here's another site that tarped this summer and seeded this past week. Some benefits of tarping include reduced herbicide use, reduced tillage. It may create a habitat for spiders, and it covers the soil from weed seeds that may be blown onto the site during that year of preparation. Oh, and we also have a pollinator habitat sign from the Xerces Society, as you can see. And speaking of seeds, some of these native or naturalized seeds that go into the pollinator meadows can be quite tiny, as shown with the black-eyed Susan on the left, in contrast to a partridge pea on the right. You can see how it could take a couple years for a perennial plant to grow from a tiny fleck to a robust blooming plant. And here in these photos, you can see Xerces staff seeding wildflower meadows and using a lawn roller to compact those seeds into the soil. And those tiny seeds want to be near the soil surface, but we also don't want them to blow away. So compaction helps them to gently work them into the soil along with the freeze and thaw of the winter. And after site preparation, you could choose to direct seed the meadow, as seen in the photos, or you could consider transplanting live plants from pots or plug trays into the soil. I wanted to share some considerations between seeding and transplanting. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but depending on your timeline and resources, you can see what works best for your conservation efforts. If you wanted to seed in the Northeast, we'd recommend seeding in the fall after a couple of frosts. If you wanted to transplant live plant plugs, generally you're going to have the most availability in the spring, but it could be done in the fall, particularly if you were growing your own and you had access. And if funding is tight, seed is definitely going to be more affordable than transplanting live plants. And the species diversity that's available is generally more robust when purchasing seed rather than plants. Ideally, we'd be purchasing local ecotypes or species that have been grown in the region and are adapted to those specific conditions. It's possible to find locally adapted plant plugs, but you might have to search a little harder than you would if you were to seed your meadow. However, for impatient people, seeding takes longer to establish. By transplanting live plant plugs, you can shave off a year of establishment time, maybe 2. Another major consideration is that when you purchase live plants, is to purchase ones that don't have pesticide residues on or within the plants. So now we'll delve into sourcing bee-safe plants. Why should we be seeking these bee-safe plants out? Many of us plant flowers in our communities to add beauty to our world, but the value of plants, especially those that flower, is beyond aesthetic. Flowering plants play a vital role in supporting pollinators, who likewise are vital for supporting native ecosystems and our food systems. Flowering plants need bees, but bees also need flowers. For example, bees consume nectar from flowers. It's sweet and a major energy source. On the left, you can see a photo of a sweat bee sipping nectar from the petals of a bee balm plant. Bees also need pollen from flowers. Bees are the only animals that deliberately collect pollen as food for their young. On the right, you can see a scanning electron micrograph showing what pollen looks like up close. This picture is colorized. Notice the different shapes and sizes. The bottom photo shows how a tunnel nesting bee nest looks. You can see how the queen has divided the tunnel into cells separated by mud walls. On each cell, she's placed a ball of pollen and then laid an egg atop the mass of pollen. When the egg hatches into a baby larva, it feeds on this pollen until it pupates. So that pollen and what's in that pollen is pretty darn important. So if it's toxic, the adult or the larvae can die or suffer other ill effects. Let's think about production. Wholesale nurseries are often producing in a high volume, and appearance is important for this agricultural crop. After all, people buy plants to beautify their spaces, right? So even damage that doesn't harm the growth or vigor of the plant may spur the use of pesticides. The US EPA, which regulates pesticides, also allow nurseries to apply many pesticides at higher rates compared to the rates approved for food uses. It's also a good time to say that the term pesticide is kind of an umbrella term, and it includes insecticides, of course, but also fungicides and herbicides. There are many ways that bees can pick up pesticides, or what we call residue or contamination. Let's go over the 5 main ways. First is the most obvious one. Bees can be sprayed directly if plants are sprayed during bloom or when bees are active. Bees can also be exposed by visiting flowers that were previously sprayed. Some pesticides don't break down immediately, meaning that bees can bring contaminated pollen back to their nests, even if the spray has happened when the bees weren't around. Bees may also collect nest materials from plants that may contain pesticides in or on them. Nearly all of our native bees collect leaf parts to create cells or nest in the ground. So if leaves or soil are contaminated, bees can be exposed. Finally, systemic pesticides work by being absorbed by plants and moving or being translocated inside of the plant tissue, which can then be expressed in the pollen and nectar of flowers. Bees collecting pollen and nectar or leaves can be exposed days, weeks, even sometimes months or years after systemic application. This is particularly the case with woody ornamentals such as shrubs or trees. So plants or soil that are contaminated from applications while at the nursery could expose bees after sale to the consumer in 4 of these 5 ways. One of the most widely used classes of pesticides are the neonicotinoids. It's systemic, meaning that it's uptaken into the body of the plant and expressed in the nectar and pollen in the flowering plants. It's water soluble, so even after transplanting, it can move through the soil solution and can be uptaken by other flowering plants growing nearby in the garden. There's a ton of research showing that the 4 neonics listed here are harmful to bees and a wide range of other insects. We have a number of studies showing neonics present in nursery plants at retail and commercial production outlets across the country at dangerous levels. And while it appears that many wholesalers have started to move away from use of neonics, they're still out there. So ask your vendors for plants grown without neonicotinoids. It's important to ask because despite widespread reports that most wholesalers are growing neonic-free, only a few nurseries who are growing neonic-free actually state that on the product label or on their websites. You can see this label from Blooming Nursery in Oregon, which clearly states neonicotinoid-free at the bottom. I know some of this information can be overwhelming, so I want to let you know that you can get more detail from our new fact sheets, Buying Bee-Safe Plants and Offering Bee-Safe Plants, a guide for nurseries. Both of these fact sheets are available on our website for downloading. And if you're working with a group and want multiple copies, please feel free to contact us at pesticides@xerces.org. We also put together a nice postcard with the salient, simple 3 steps. Seek out organic plants and seeds. The certified organic symbol means that no synthetic pesticides have been used on the plant, and the nursery's practices have been inspected and verified by a third party. In small native plant nurseries, you may be able to find organically grown plants more easily. In retail garden centers, it's often difficult to find certified organic ornamentals, but we're hopeful that supply will expand and as consumers increase that demand. So please ask for this, especially when you're buying a plant that's attractive to pollinators. Second, avoid plants grown with neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides. Number 3, ask which steps your nursery takes to offer plants grown using pollinator-friendly pest management. And then a 4th recommendation is, where possible, grow your own flowers from seed and avoid using pesticides, of course. What I found to be particularly helpful when starting a dialogue with a nursery manager is Table 1 in the publication called Offering Bee-Safe Plants, a guide for nurseries. In this table, we've included active ingredients in the neonic class that are particularly toxic to the pollinators shown in the previous slide. Likewise, there are other 2 classes of pesticides that are less widely known, but are also systemic, and some active ingredients in these classes pose risk to pollinators. Some active ingredients in these classes, the butanoids and diamides, should be avoided as well. Pesticides to avoid is the starting point for talking to nurseries, but the guidance in these publications also provides a wider framework for pollinator-friendly pest management for nurseries or methods that you can use at home as well if you're growing your own. Also, when purchasing plants, I encourage you to seek out native plants and plants that have pollen and nectar. Many of our ornamental varieties are non-native and have been bred and selected for human aesthetic and not for the forage value of insects. Other garden varieties can look beautiful and provide lots of nectar and pollen for insect forage. I highly recommend that you spend time observing flowering plants in your yard or in your landscape that you visit to see which flowers are providing the most value. Keep in mind that native pollinators have co-evolved alongside native plants. And if you're looking to support these invertebrates, seek out native plants that are adapted to the conditions of the site. If you're looking for more free resources of where to start, please visit us online. And for further reading, we also have some wonderful books. And with that, it concludes my part of the presentation. I'd like to thank you for your interest in invertebrate conservation, and I hope that you can help spread the word and take action in your communities. If you aren't already a land steward or you're not sure where to start, reach out to the New Hampshire Audubon and volunteer with their pollinator habitat creation and management. And I can certainly take some questions as the time allows. And next will be Emma.
Thanks so much, Alina. Couple questions for you. Can you do a mixture of seeding and transplants?
Yeah, you can. So we didn't go over it today in our webinar, but one of the major methods for kind of weeding the pollinator meadow as you establish it from seed is that high mowing, or I guess Marc did mention it, the mowing to 8 inches. And so that's where it might get a little bit dicey if you've direct seeded something and transplanted something. So I would just say you could direct seed, but maybe direct seed and then maybe a year later add those transplants, or you could do it on the edge in a way so that you can manage them. Because for the most part, if you're transplanting, you're going to water it, and you're going to most likely be hand weeding that or spot treating that. And so mowing is not going to be your method. So just need to make sure that you take those into consideration. But yeah, you can do both. And some of them establish better from, for example, golden Alexanders or milkweed. You're going to have a much better likelihood of success if you do it from plant plugs or some other asexual form of planting it, starting from a bigger piece of a root rather than a really tiny seed.
Gotcha. And what was the thickness of those plastic tarps? I think we used 6 millimeter.
Yeah, I think anywhere from 4 to 6 would do it. The thicker, the more, if you're going to use it many times over the years on multiple sites, I'd probably go thicker just to maintain integrity. But yeah, around there is perfect.
Yeah, I think I saw like 10 mil and I was like, what? How is that even possible? And it was like way more expensive. So it was like the middle ground at 6.
Yeah, and something to consider is it is silage tarp. So if you do know of someone with a dairy, they might have a piece of it laying around.
And just a pointed question again, what was the purpose of the tarps?
Oh, the purpose of the tarps is to prepare the site. So if you're starting with really aggressive non-native grasses, not only do you want to terminate those grasses, but you also want to remove the residue. So basically you're just starting with a clean slate and you're looking to have bare soil in order to direct seed plants and not have issues with weeds over the years, because it's a little different than just an annual vegetable garden where you get to maybe use some tillage every year to help with the weeds. In a perennial system, you don't want to be fighting back the weeds continuously. You want to kind of do it really well in the beginning and during those establishment years with your high mowing, in hopes that you will not be experiencing them, 5 years down the line.
Yeah. One other question, and then we'll move on. With till, is there a concern with killing microbe activity?
Yeah, so definitely the microbes will be disturbed for that year of tillage. We know that the fungal part of that ecosystem is going to be especially disrupted. But as with all site preparation methods, you are going to have that basically 1 year of disturbance where it's not the best. But for that 1 year of disturbance, the whole idea is that you're going to have this perennial, what you might consider permanent habitat for these invertebrates after the fact. So it's kind of this short-term loss for a long-term gain. And over time, that's going to equilibrate, and it's going to be okay. They'll come back again.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Alina. You have a couple questions that I think you can answer by typing them out or sending a link to what that organic symbol looks like. But we're going to move on to Emma Erler, who's already started her screen share. We are so smooth tonight. Thanks, Emma, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for everybody who tuned in tonight. My job now, hopefully you've learned everything you need to, or at least you've gotten to start thinking about what you need to prepare your meadow site going forward. So I'm stepping into the point where we're actually choosing what we're planting here. And I'm assuming that most of you are probably going to be seeding a meadow because it's the thriftier way to go. It's definitely less expensive to go from seed. And like Alina said, you can grow probably the greatest diversity of plants too, or the greatest variety from seed. Just so you know, I have it up there, but I work for UNH Cooperative Extension as a landscape field specialist. I'm actually the only landscape field specialist right now, but essentially that means I'm focused on all things ornamental horticulture, which wildflower meadows falls under. All right, so I'm gonna get going here. All right, so for some of you who are gardeners, this little phrase here is nothing new, I'm sure. Basically, when you are planting anything, you want to make sure you're choosing the right plant for the right place, for the right function or right purpose. This is absolutely true for seed mixes as well. So what we're going to start with is actually a little bit of a site assessment. So first things first, you're going to want to take a look at the soils on the site where you're planning on seeding your meadow. To be in the broadest sense, we can call soils well drained, which that tends to be a very sandy soil, which doesn't hold on to moisture for very long. Very coarse. If you were to do a field test with that soil, it would feel gritty. You wouldn't be able to form it into a ball or a ribbon. Very common in New Hampshire. Sandy soils or well-drained soils in upland areas are really what we see more often than not. A moist soil is kind of that perfect garden loam, perfect soil you can imagine that has a lot of organic matter, holds on to moisture pretty well after rain events. So it's kind of the absolute ideal. In most cases, we're probably not going to have that perfect moist soil when we're putting in a wildflower meadow, and that's absolutely okay. But if you do, then your job is going to be a lot easier getting that meadow established. And then of course you can have wet or boggy soils. And these are going to be soils that drain very slowly. So areas where you see puddling after a rain event, where you might see some wetland plants, if you're real keen on plant ID. And actually having that sort of soil too is totally fine. You can absolutely have wildflower meadow in that sort of site. And it's just going to change a little bit what sort of plants you're going to want to select. You're also going to want to look at sun exposure. The ideal when we're putting in a wildflower meadow is to have a full sun site. And so for me, I consider that any site that gets at least 8 hours a day of full direct sunlight. If you have a site that gets less than that though, what we call, part sun or part shade, perhaps this is a spot near the edge of the forest. Perhaps it's going to get shaded by a building, something like that. That's okay too. The majority of species that are put into wildflower seed mixes are also okay with a part sun sort of situation. If you do have a shadier spot where you want to put in a meadow, it gets a little bit trickier because most of the species we're talking about really are prairie plants. So these are things that like to grow in these open grasslands. But that doesn't mean you don't have any options. There definitely are a number of species that are okay with shade. You'll just, again, want to make sure that you're choosing the right ones so you have the most success possible. Okay, so getting into actually choosing your mix and taking a look at which species are going to be in that mix. A lot of what I'm going to share here, or pretty much all of it in terms of mix selection, was, let's see, what am I trying to say, was found out through research by Dr. Kathy Neal, who is an emeritus professor at the University of New Hampshire. She did a bunch of wildflower trials at actually in Durham on Woodman Farm. And there were actually some other wildflower meadows that were put in other parts of the state as well. One large one in Boscawen, put in by Amy Papineau. So everything, or not, maybe not everything, but majority of what I'm going to share here came from that research that was conducted 2015, 2018 or so. Okay, so the ideal mix is typically going to contain at least 15 to 20 wildflower species. And like Alina mentioned, 3 to 5 native warm season grasses. Those wildflower species, those are going to be all your flowering plants that are actually going to attract pollinators. Those grasses are going to provide good cover for nesting habitat for a bunch of pollinators. Grasses also have a deeper root system or a more fibrous root system, which holds soil in place quite well. In addition to forming a real dense cover that can outcompete weeds. So having grasses in that mix is really critical. And then something else I encourage you to look for is a mix that has few, if any, annual plants in it. Some of the cheaper mixes out there might have a whole bunch of annual species in them, which is great the first season because you get a bunch of really nice color that first year, but they don't tend to be very sustainable. So you might only have that color for a couple of years before your meadow kind of turns into a weed patch. So ideally, we really do want to be planting perennial species with maybe just a few annuals, or making sure your mix has one of these or both of these plants that I have on the screen here, black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia there on the bottom, or spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata. Both of these will often grow pretty quickly, and you might get a bloom your first year. So you won't have to wait the full 3 years to get a little bit of color and have some benefit to pollinators. Of course, a question always comes up here, are the plants we're talking about native, right? So everything we're thinking about putting in our wildflower meadow, we'd probably assume is native. I think if you want to have a super diverse wildflower meadow on your property, you have to kind of extend the definition of native beyond New Hampshire, beyond New England. These are on your screen right now, 2 species that would commonly make it into a wildflower meadow mix, purple coneflower and Joe pieweed. But that purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, would not grow in New Hampshire in the wild. We really don't have a natural prairie ecosystem going in New Hampshire, but that's not to say this plant can't do really well when we have it in open meadow field situations in New Hampshire. So perfectly, as far as I'm concerned, perfectly acceptable, a part of wildflower meadows, and a number of the species that are going to make it into the mixes that are out there are going to contain a bunch of prairie species, native to North America, just not native to New England. And of course, there are plenty as well that are native to New England. So that Joe pieweed, for example, can be found throughout New Hampshire and really throughout most of eastern half of North America. So don't get too hung up on the native thing. Moving on here, most likely what the majority of you are probably going to go with is going to be a pre-made mix, mainly because these are convenient. There are a few companies that make these mixes that are really high quality, and I'll share those in a little bit, few options you might have for shopping. But you do have to be a little bit careful when you are selecting these. Some of the species that end up in some of these mixes might not be successful in New England, or they might end up being kind of aggressive. So you will maybe have some options when you're shopping of actually choosing something that's a Northeast mix or a New England mix. Anything like that's probably a good indication that particular mix is going to be appropriate. It's also worth noting that the less expensive mixes tend to contain a higher proportion of grasses to wildflowers. So you may not get quite as good a habitat for pollinating insects. And then again, paying attention to the number of annuals in those mixes. The majority or all the seed companies that I'm familiar with in terms of ordering, you can actually look at what species are in that mix. So you can figure out, okay, what's in here? Is this good? Is this not? Kathy Neal, in part of her research came up with a custom wildflower mix that has turned out to work really well in southern New Hampshire. And I suspect it probably would do well just about anywhere in New Hampshire. You can see, looking at this mix, that it's 50% perennial wildflowers and 50% warm season grasses. So that's kind of an important ratio there on something that you're probably going to want to aim for. Probably don't want more than 50% grasses. You could have a little bit less than that, but somewhere along those lines is probably going to be the sweet spot. This particular mix is appropriate for any full sun site that has a medium, or you could say moist to dry soil with a pH that's 5.5 or above. Something I hadn't mentioned yet is that it's probably worthwhile to have the soil tested before you go ahead and seed your wildflower meadow. Usually you don't have to add any amendments to a wildflower meadow. Most of these species are going to be totally fine with just native conditions. And that pH of 5.5 is pretty acidic. And that's honestly what you'd most likely find on an undisturbed site in New Hampshire. If it was much lower than that, more acidic, then maybe you would add some lime. But that's probably pretty standard. And then the seeding rate with this particular mix is 0.5 pound per 1,000 square feet. And Mark mentioned earlier, seeding at the proper rate for the mix you choose is going to be critical in order to have good success. So this particular mix, just so you know, UNH doesn't actually make this mix or sell this mix. This is just a recipe that exists. So if you wanted to have a custom mix made up for your own project, this is one possibility, something that you could give to the seed distributor or seed vendor for what you'd like. This is going to be pretty hard for you to read, but this resource is available on our website. And actually, we have a whole bunch of great resources on the UNH Extension website on pollinator meadows, on wildflowers in New Hampshire and New England. This particular sheet that you're looking at here, this particular table, is showing you wildflowers that Kathy Neal looked at and determined how well or how appropriate they were for New Hampshire. So everything on here, or everything that's on this particular table, which actually isn't even the whole table, these are all species that were shown to do well, at least in the southern half of New Hampshire. And I think this particular table is helpful because if you are shopping for a pre-made mix from a seed company, you could reference this and just see if that particular mix you're looking at has some of these species that have been proven to do well in New Hampshire. Alina touched on this too, but I figured I'd pull it up again. The ideal mix too is going to provide a continuous sequence of blooms. So ideally, you're going to have things that are in bloom from really late May through October. And this is just part of a larger table that's on our website, but something that's worth looking at too. If you're buying a pre-made mix, you don't have a lot of say in that. Although typically those mixes are designed so that they have a full season of bloom. But if for some reason you're making your own mix, this is just something you might consult. So, like I said, there's a whole bunch of mixes out there that you have to choose from. I'm kind of choosing a few plants for the extremes. So dry soils, as well as wet soils on the next slide. A lot of mixes that are out there are formulated more or less for certain site conditions. So for dry soils or for wetter soils. On this page here, basically just some species that really thrive in dry soils. So in that real poor sandy soil that you might have on your site, because it's so common in New Hampshire. These are all perennials that would likely do pretty well. So I just highlighted two of my favorites here, personal favorites. Butterfly milkweed, the orange plant that's up there on the right corner. And then Monarda fistulosa wild bee balm, that's in the lower, it's the lower picture there. Monarda fistulosa, that wild bee balm, is a super adaptable perennial, and you'd be hard pressed to find a wildflower seed mix that didn't include that plant, just because it will take a wet soil to a certain extent, although it's going to be probably happiest in a moist or a dry soil. And then if you have a real wet soil spot, you're probably going to want to make sure at least some of these species here in that mix, or that you add in some of these species to your mix, so that you have some plants that are really going to thrive in that wet area or in the broader meadow. And the two plants I featured here, the one on the top is cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. This is a plant that you find growing in the wild along wetland margins in New Hampshire. Typically blooms in late summer. Really gorgeous. Also a prized perennial for, you know, any ornamental bed. And then the bottom picture there is false sneezeweed, Helenium autumnale, which is a really, really excellent plant for bees, and it is a late bloomer, but it likes wet soil. You're not going to have very good luck with it in dry sites, but if you have a wetter soil, that plant's going to do really well. Oops. Just so you're all aware, growing a wildflower meadow from seed is pretty expensive. And I've probably lowballed us here saying that you should expect a quality mix to cost at least $50 to $100 per 1,000 square feet. That's pretty conservative. It can definitely be a bit more than that. So that's part of the reason you want to be so thoughtful in your site preparation and in choosing the best mix for your site, so that you're not wasting money on this stuff. And then the proportion of wildflowers to grasses in a mix is going to influence price. Some of the more budget mixes are going to have a higher percentage of grasses, which is totally fine. It just means you won't have quite as much forage for pollinators in that meadow area. In terms of ordering seed, ideally, you're probably going to get your order in early summer to avoid shortages. Most people are looking at doing their planting in the fall. So ordering, you know, before crunch time, right before planting, is really the ideal. If you order it early, let's say May, June or so, and you receive that seed, you are going to want to store it properly before you go to actually seed it. And that's going to mean refrigerating if you have the room. And really, these seeds are very, very small, so it shouldn't take up too much room in the fridge. Or if you don't have room for that, basically in any other cool, dry spot you can find. So maybe that's a dry basement or something. And then if you can, this was just some advice from Dr. Neal, ask for the grass seed to be packaged separately from the wildflower seed, just because it can be fluffier and a bit bigger. And it's nice to be able to mix it in later in the process rather than have it all clumped up together in that initial mix. Okay, so as I promised, some potential seed mix sources for your meadow. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other options, but these are at least 4 companies that are located at least in the more or less eastern half of the country. There are some Western seed sources as well, but then we're getting beyond the realm of plants that are going to be appropriate for our climate in New Hampshire. Any of these, companies would be appropriate, and all of them, because I've looked at their catalogs many times, have a number of mixes that could potentially work for sites in New Hampshire. You'll just have to do a little bit of research, and if you have the time, ideally look at what the components are of each mix you're considering and compare it to those charts I shared earlier. Make sure there are plenty of species on there that match up with the plants that have been shown to do well in New Hampshire. It doesn't have to be exact. It probably won't be, but just make sure there's, a good percentage there, what we're looking for. And I'll finish up here with a few planting tips. So in terms of actually seeding your meadow, fall is going to be the ideal for wildflowers. A lot of these perennial species that you're going to be planting benefit from going through a cold, wet period. So that natural winter cycle is actually going to help them germinate better. So this probably means mid-October onwards, ideally before the first snow. Not the worst thing actually to sow over top of the snow if you have to, but you're probably going to have perhaps a little bit better luck if you get good soil contact before the snow comes. My fear is if you sow on top, that seed might end up kind of clumped and just loose, not pressed into that soil surface. So that's kind of the ideal. Plenty of time yet to sow this fall. And then in terms of actually sowing that seed, as Marc mentioned, the seed is super, super tiny. And so it's not going to seem like very much when you go to actually seed your meadow. And something that can be really helpful in terms of spreading this seed out evenly, because it is so tiny and so easy to go through quickly, is to actually bulk it up with a carrier. So that could be something like vermiculite, which is a really common component of potting mixes. It's a volcanic rock, or sand. So essentially what you're going to do is what Amy P is doing in this picture. She has a bucket full of vermiculite that she is lightly moistening with some water. It doesn't need to be soggy, it just needs to be moist. And then she's going to mix in her wildflower seeds first, and then her grasses. So those very small seeds are adhering to that carrier, either that vermiculite or sand. And you've got this larger volume of mix to toss around. So hopefully you're getting a nice even distribution. And about a half a gallon to a gallon of carrier per 500 square feet should be appropriate. And then, seeding by hand is probably what the majority of people are going to do. You saw that's what was done at Audubon. Whatever you can do to ensure uniformity is ideal. So probably actually in the ideal situation, you just have one person doing it for the most uniform seeding. But if you have a huge plot, of course, and a whole bunch of volunteers, totally fine to get everybody involved. Rolling or pressing that seed into the soil for good seed soil contact's great. Obviously, if you have a roller like this, an attachment on a tractor, that's awesome. If you don't, that roller like Marc showed is great. Or another option too is just to press the seed into the soil with the back of a rake. And then here's that covering of the seed with that weed-free straw. That's just going to help keep the seed in place, help keep it a little bit moist, and should improve overall germination or overall success of your meadow. If you don't have that, it's okay. But if you can get your hands on some straw, that would be ideal. And then you shouldn't need to water, fertilize, or really add any compost or anything to your meadow. Once you've seeded it, you're really just waiting and seeing to see what happens. And that's it. That's all I have. That's probably plenty though, right?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emma. So I don't see any questions so far. So if you are out there with a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. And to respond to somebody's answer, oh, here's a question. Do birds eat seeds after you drop them down there?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. It's going to be pretty hard to keep birds off of the seed, though. That's something the straw might help with a little bit. Probably also a good reason to sow right before it snows. So you have that seed out for the shortest amount of time possible for so you don't have too many critters taking off of the seed.
All right, we've got another question. What if it's drought season and you seed? Would watering be necessary?
It shouldn't be. So these perennial plants, the wildflowers and the grasses, they're not going to germinate until after they've gone through that vernalization period or that cold, wet winter period. So when you sow in the fall, they're basically just kind of sit there. And then if we have a normal winter, we're going to have some snow or at least some rain, and those seeds are going to get moistened. And in a typical spring too, we have nice rainy conditions. So there's really no need to water. And even in that following season, you probably, if we're in an extreme drought, maybe it might be helpful to water. But a lot of these species, they're grassland species that are adapted to dry conditions. So we really shouldn't have to be worrying too much about watering.
And as far as the timing, you said mid-October, which that's what we did. But I also heard that we might have had better luck if we waited till after a frost. Can you weigh in on that debate?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, a lot of the seed companies recommend that you do wait to sow until, right before it snows. But I don't think that waiting till a frost is going to have that much of an impact on the seed, because it's still going to be out there for the full winter.
No,
So,
yeah, I think it's for like to kill the plants that are still there, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Like not the seeds will do fine, but like to punch down the plants.
I could see that maybe if you're concerned about annual weeds like crabgrass or I don't know, smartweed or something competing with the seeds. But I think you're fine, Mark. The one other thought is that if you miss the window in the fall, you can sow in the spring too. The thing with that is that wildflower seeds probably won't germinate quite as well in the spring. The flip side is that warm season grasses will actually germinate a little bit better. So the grasses you're putting in. So it's kind of best thing for the wildflower seeds is that fall planting. Best thing for the warm season grasses is that spring planting. But where we're probably most invested in those wildflower seeds, we just recommend seeding in the fall if you can. But
and kind of building off of that question, we've got a question. Curious if an earlier seeding, like early October, also risks that goldenrod and aster seeds flying into the plots and also germinating. Like, did we seed too soon, especially considering how warm it was this fall?
Given that goldenrods and asters are such important plants late season for pollinators, I really wouldn't be too worried about extras moving in. Sometimes you might, and even sometimes with these custom mixes, you can adapt them a little bit. If there's a ton of goldenrod already on your site, you may not really need to add any more, because some of the goldenrods can end up being a little bit aggressive and can be a complaint for people either in their meadows or in their gardens.
Yeah, our area was really heavy with the goldenrod, and if you didn't check it out, I did answer Becky's question on exactly what we seeded. And our site was kind of like a semi-dry, but with a wet area. So we used a mix and then amended it. Last question, and we'll move on to Matt, is has research been done yet to determine a potential seed mix for plants strictly native to New Hampshire to mimic or restore what a historic wildflower meadow in this state would look like?
Wow, that's a great question. Not to my knowledge. And I feel like part of the reason for that is that there isn't a whole lot of native wildflower meadow in New Hampshire.
Ah,
We're kind of a forested state, and even with our wildflower meadows, if we don't manage them, meaning get in there and mow consistently to keep the woody plants out, we'll lose our meadow. So yeah, there's of course a number of species that do grow well in openings, and of course there are native grasses and some limited grasslands in New Hampshire, but we wouldn't historically would not have had these big robust diverse meadows in our state. But we know that they're awesome for pollinating insects and for birds and all sorts of other wildlife, so there's absolutely good argument to have them, even if it may not be the natural state.
Yeah, I don't know of any actual research. I did make a couple of mixes for 2 different sites in New Hampshire this year that were pretty much, yeah, they were plant purist native mixes. So I can talk with you more about that offline. And those maps that Emma showed, not sure where she pulled them from, but they remind me of ones that I see on gobotany.com.
Those are where I pulled them from. I just didn't.
Yeah. And so I really like to use that website. And so basically, if you were looking to have only those native ones, you could search that scientific name or the common name. And on the map, if it was green, you could be relatively confident that that is the state of what's actually happening. But as you observe around New Hampshire, you'll see that there are some discrepancies. The state lines are pretty rigid compared to what natural things do.
Awesome. Thanks for weighing in, Alina. And thank you again, Emma. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
All right. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. So great. That's fantastic stuff. I'm Matt Tarr. Similar to Emma, I also work for UNH Cooperative Extension, and my role at Cooperative Extension is I serve as our statewide wildlife specialist. And in that role, myself and other colleagues within our forestry and wildlife program, natural resources program, we're available to meet with landowners in communities throughout the state, free of charge, to help folks assess what they have for different habitat components on their land, and provide recommendations for how they can maintain or improve habitat for a wide variety of wildlife species. And pollinators is one of those groups of critters that I'm super lucky to get to work with. And so in my section of this presentation, just need to change my thing here. I'm going to be focusing on how non-native plants provide some explanation for how and why specific plant species that comprise habitat matters for insects. And I'm going to be focusing on non-native plants, a lot of woody plants, which is what many of us have on our landscape, considering that we are in New Hampshire. And as Emma said, we are naturally forested, and most of our habitats tend to be woody, and that's what we start with. And what those woody plants are really do have a large role in determining how those habitats function for wildlife, and for insects in particular. And for me, when I'm talking about non-native plants, I'm really meaning plants that are non-native to the US. These are plants that have been brought by people. Most of them have been brought by people, across the ocean. They're originating in Europe or Asia. And what we find is that, a lot of the research that's been focused on pollinators and the importance of developing pollinator, plantings, is often been done in landscapes, suburban landscapes, or even in agricultural landscapes where there's a lot of like non-native plants and not perhaps a lot for some of our pollinators. So I'm going to be focusing on comparing the role of native plants versus those non-native plants as habitat for insects. And then I'll also briefly introduce how the relationship between insects and plants can also influence habitat quality for songbirds, because it's all a big connected system. And so to begin to understand how non-native plants affect habitat quality for insects, it's first important to understand that most insect species that eat plants, like caterpillars, are host specialists that use only a few very closely related plant species within the same family or genus. So for example, insects that eat oak leaves often can't or won't eat the leaves of non-oak species. So this host specialization is caused mainly by secondary chemicals that all plants produce to discourage things from eating them and to discourage other pests like fungi and bacteria. And so these chemicals control what plants and insects can and will use. So these chemicals function primarily as behavioral deterrents or attractants that insects use to identify which plants are okay for them to eat and which plants they need to avoid. And so many of these chemicals, especially those that are produced by herbaceous plants, are poisons that will outright kill an insect if it isn't adapted to deal with the specific chemicals that are produced by that plant species. And chemicals in woody plants are poisons that may or may not immediately kill an insect, but they often significantly reduce the ability of insects to digest plants that they aren't adapted to eat. So that causes them to grow slowly and then ultimately starve. And so as a result, most insects won't eat plants they aren't adapted to eat, even if those plants are the only ones that are available for them. And so we find it's believed that most insects must evolve, either over hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of years to be able to overcome behavioral and physiological barriers that are created by the specific chemicals that are produced by particular plant species. So for example, the milky sap that's produced by milkweed, that it's a cardiac glycoside that's seriously poisonous to most insects and vertebrates. However, monarch caterpillars have evolved genetic mutations that allow them to eat milkweed without suffering any ill effects. And in fact, monarch caterpillars, they sequester the milkweed toxins into their skin, and they use them as a defense that makes both the caterpillars and the adult butterfly toxic to predators such as birds, which will typically vomit if they mistakenly eat one, and they usually don't make the mistake again. So monarch butterflies, adult butterflies, they use chemical cues from the plants to accurately identify and lay their eggs on milkweed plants to ensure that their caterpillars will grow up on the correct host plants. And so if you attempt to raise monarch caterpillars on basically any other plant type other than milkweed, those caterpillars will starve, they'll die. So we find that an insect can usually use any plant within the same family or genus as a host plant. And this is because closely related plants usually use a similar array of chemicals for their defense. And so certain native trees and shrub species we find typically host an abundance of herbivorous insects, especially caterpillars. So this table, this is from research that's done by Doug Tallamy. I think most folks who are familiar with pollinators know the name Doug Tallamy. He's got a great book, Bringing Nature Home. He has many great books, but that was the first one that most folks are familiar with, Bringing Nature Home. And Doug and his students down in the Delaware area, have done lots of research on plants and insect associations. And so this table is from one of his studies that show the top 20 plant genera in the eastern US that typically support the greatest variety and abundance of caterpillars. So on the right side of this table where it says Lepidoptera richness, that just means the number of species of moth and butterfly caterpillars that use that plant genera as a host. And so at the top of this list, we find oaks, cherries, willows, birches, poplars or aspens, blueberries, and maples. So these are all super common plant species that occur in almost every yard that I visit throughout New Hampshire. And so, that's really important for folks to, I think, to recognize that some of the top at least from a butterfly and moth perspective and caterpillar perspective, some of the best plants that are available, you know, in a landscape are probably already occurring on your property. So that's important to think about when you're planning some of these pollinator plantings. So what we find is that non-native plants that lack native relatives, they typically support few herbivorous insects because those plants usually have unique chemicals that native insects haven't evolved to tolerate. Now, from a wider habitat perspective, caterpillars are a super important food source that most of our songbirds feed to their nestlings and fledglings, and adult birds prefer to forage on plant species that support abundant caterpillars when they're feeding their young. So understanding how non-native plants affects caterpillars and other insects, it's important for understanding a part of why how non-native plants can affect habitat quality for birds. And so in the next few slides, I'll actually summarize some of the research that has been done investigating how non-native plants affect caterpillar abundance. And most of this research has been conducted in the eastern US, and some of it has been conducted by myself and other students at UNH here in New Hampshire. So consistently, we find that the non-native invasive shrubs, particularly autumn olive, common and glossy buckthorn, and the honeysuckles typically support very few caterpillars. And we believe this is due in part to the fact that these plants have few or no native relatives that caterpillars have evolved with here in the US. And so the fact that very few caterpillars or really any other insects eat the foliage of these shrubs actually gives these shrubs a competitive advantage over native plants that are regularly attacked by insects. And so that contributes to their ability to be invasive. Interestingly, research from New Hampshire has found that non-native multiflora rose often supports as many or more caterpillars than most of the native shrubs that it commonly grows around. And grows with. And we believe this is because that there are many native rose species that occur, and the caterpillars that are adapted to use native roses seem to be able to tolerate the chemicals of multiflora rose, and they readily use it as an alternate host. So it's important to recognize that that native trees and shrubs don't always support more caterpillars or insects than the quote unquote worst invasive plants or invasive non-native invasive shrubs that we have. So this figure shows the average caterpillar abundance that I measured on 15 different species of the most common trees and shrubs growing in shrubby habitats in southeastern in New Hampshire. So during this year of the study, which was in 2013, there were very few caterpillars as expected on the non-native glossy buckthorn and autumn olive, but very surprisingly to me, we found comparatively few caterpillars on native red maple, arrowwood, and oak. And in this year of the study, the greatest abundance of caterpillars was found on native birches, speckled alder, willows, meadowsweet, and sweet fern, all very, very common native plants. So, very importantly, like all research, this is just a snapshot taken in one area at a particular time. And so these are average patterns that we observed on plant species in southeastern New Hampshire in 2013. And so we should expect that these patterns would differ among plants growing in different locations and among these same plants in different years. And as we'll see in the next slide, even on the same plants during different times of the same year. So it's important to when we're planning habitat management and we're thinking about, you know, what plants do we take out and what plants do we encourage. It's important to recognize that caterpillar and insect abundance varies tremendously on the same plant species from within a year from spring to fall due to differences on when different caterpillars and insects emerge on their host plants. So this figure shows how caterpillar abundance varied on the same species of shrubs from the last slide during different samples that were collected in mid-June, early July, and in late July. And what we found is that in mid-June, caterpillar abundance was greatest on meadowsweet and comparatively low on all other species. But by late July, just a few weeks later, caterpillar abundance was highest on maleberry and willow, which had very few or no caterpillars just a few weeks before. And so these results are very typical of lots of insect studies that show us very consistently that plants that support lots of caterpillars today may support very few caterpillars later or earlier in the year. And so these figures help to illustrate two really important points when we're thinking about habitat management. The first is that a monoculture, which is basically when you have one or a few plant species, just dominates the habitat with few others. So a monoculture of any plant species, whether it's native or non-native, really isn't that good if we want to manage habitats that are capable of supporting a diversity and abundance of insects, and particularly caterpillars. It also shows that the best way that we can encourage and support a variety of caterpillars and other insects is and ultimately by butterflies and moths, is to encourage and maintain a diversity of plant species within a habitat. And ideally, the plant community should be composed primarily of a variety of native plants whenever possible. So the question is, well, when do native plants actually reduce caterpillar abundance within a habitat? And so that reduction seems to occur when the non-native invasive plants, usually invasive plants, grow abundantly enough to significantly reduce native plant diversity and abundance. And so the research shows there seems to be what I call some like non-native plant tipping points that are emerging from some of our recent studies. So in suburban neighborhoods, and this is basically most of Doug Talamy's work where he does most of his research in suburban neighborhoods, they found that the lowest caterpillar abundance was found in neighborhoods where non-native plants accounted for as little as 30% of the plant cover. Now, here in New Hampshire, where we've done most of our work in more kind of natural, less developed shrubland habitats, we've found caterpillar abundance isn't typically significantly reduced until non-native shrubs account for as much as 55% of the plant cover. So that's a pretty big difference between these habitat types. And so I suspect the difference is due in part to the fact that the shrubland habitats that we study and kind of the neighborhoods that we often are dealing with here in New Hampshire, unless you're really developed landscape, these habitats are often composed by an overall greater diversity of native plant species than compared to what typically occur in very developed suburban neighborhoods, where a large proportion of the understory plant cover is often absent. It's just been removed. And so our research in the shrublands suggests that if we can maintain native plant species diversity and abundance, that probably helps keep caterpillar and other insect abundance high, even when the proportion of non-native plants in the habitat approaches 50%. So these are really the only studies that have tried to quantify how invasive plants influence caterpillar abundance within habitats. So it's clear we need a whole lot more research here, and research from a greater variety of habitats and regions. But one thing that's interesting, and I'd be interested in Alina's comments here, is that we find that plants that support very few caterpillars often provide great sources of nectar and pollen for a variety of pollinators. So invasive plants, often produce an abundance of flowers. And what from my understanding and when I read from the research, is that most of the insects that are host specialists as caterpillars are often very general in regard to what plant species they're able to collect nectar from. However, so for example, Japanese knotweed, this is like my nemesis is Japanese knotweed. I've got this is my worst of the worst, but however, when you go into a Japanese, and so I have very few good things to say about Japanese knotweed. However, that said, it's important to realize that no plant is inherently, at least entirely bad. I mean, if you go into a stand of Japanese knotweed in the fall, when it's in flower, it's often the only plant in flower in that habitat, and it is absolutely loaded with pollinators, collecting nectar. So I'm not advocating for Japanese knotweed, but just pointing out that these plants that we often just revile as like horrible things can function as habitat. So, however, that said, we have and this is some research from Xerces, and again, Alina can correct me if anything I have here is incorrect or she wants to add that, here in the Northeast, we have about 60 species of native bees that are pollen specialists. And the plants that tend to support the greatest number of these pollen specialists in our region tend to be native goldenrods, willows, asters, and the blueberries. So how do you make your landscape the most attractive and beneficial to support the greatest diversity of pollinators? Well, we've heard this time and again, and I think it's just important to restate it. The most effective way is to encourage and maintain a diversity of plant species, and ideally those plant species should be native. And ideally, we would like to plan our landscapes so we're maintaining a diversity of plant species that bloom in succession throughout the growing season. And so we're selecting plants that collectively will flower in progression from spring and fall. And again, here, I'll just say that one mistake that I often see folks make when they plan their pollinator plantings is that they ignore or they forget about trees and shrubs, which also provide great flowers. So for example, red maple provides some of the first flowers of the year in many areas, and that makes red maple especially valuable as habitat for pollinators when very few other flowers have started to bloom. So it's really important to assess the plants that are growing at your site carefully before you remove plants to establish a pollinator planting. And again, folks at Cooperative Extension can often provide some assistance in helping you do that assessment. So I'll just end here by once again directing you to the fantastic resources that are on the UNH Cooperative Extension website. That includes a ton of great information about pollinator ecology and how to improve habitat for pollinators. This again is a lot of the work has been done by Dr. Kathy Neal, fantastic lists. And again, I just love this chart here that it's a slightly expanded version of a portion of what Emma had shown earlier, where Dr. Neal has that list of flowers, and then she provides a great chart for when those flowers are in bloom and the color of those flowers as well. So I think the links have been provided, but if you might be able to find it just as easy as typing in planting for pollinators UNH into a search engine, it will come up. So with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that folks have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. We got one question so far that I'll start with. In the research, what's the general thought on multiflora rows? Good or not good?
So the words good and not good are human words that no wildlife species necessarily know what the meaning of. So, a lot of the values that we put on plants are based on our human biases. So there's no plant that's all bad, from a habitat perspective. Every plant has a habitat role. That we're concerned about many of these non-native plants. We're concerned about the non-native plants that have the potential to become invasive, and in under the right conditions, they can form those monocultures that can reduce habitat quality. So multiflora rose, is not a plant that we would encourage because in a lot of habitats, it has the potential to become very invasive. And in fact, in New Hampshire, it's illegal to plant, it's illegal to propagate, and it's illegal to move multiflora rose. We have a list of prohibited plants in our state because we want to discourage these plants from spreading. But from a habitat perspective, I'm going to say this, but I'm not advocating for multiflora rose. It's a fantastic plant from a wide variety of habitat perspectives. We see that it provides great, flowers and food sources for our pollinators. It's fantastic cover. It provides a fruit that hangs on into the wintertime. Some of our endangered, like New England cottontails, it's fantastic cover for them. So it was introduced, that plant, like many of our invasives, were introduced into the States because of its habitat value. So, but it's not one that we like to encourage.
Yeah, as you know, we have a big old patch of knotweed, and you're right. In the fall, it's like just covered in monarch butterflies, just eating that nectar. And it's like, why? I don't want to love you, but it's so beautiful.
Right.
Are the berries of common buckthorn poisonous to birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something that gets tossed around a lot, and there's no so all plants are producing chemicals, and all plants dump a ton of chemicals into their fruits to keep things from eating their fruits until that plant is ready for its fruit to be dispersed. So for example, you go to your Macintosh, apple tree, and you pull off one of those apples when it's still green. Oh, you can't even choke it down if you try. That's because of the chemicals that's in it. That plant has dumped a bunch of chemicals in there to keep its fruit intact until its seeds are ready to go. And so what we find is that almost all plants, as soon as their seeds are ready to be dispersed, the chemical concentration in those seeds almost is zero. And so at that point, that same fruit is nice and sweet and tasty. It's the exact same fruit. It's just the chemical composition has changed. And so what we find is that all of these plants are producing chemicals, and birds, as a general rule, avoid eating unripe fruits because they taste horrible and they're toxic if you eat too many of them. But when those fruits are ripe, the chemical concentrations of those fruits is very, very low, and then they're readily available, and most of them are quite nutritious for a wide variety of birds. And that's why many of these plants are so invasive, is because they're spread by birds.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then a follow-up question to, I think, the buckthorn piece. And do you recommend the removal of that buckthorn? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't make the blanket removal. I don't make the blanket recommendation to remove anything until you've assessed the habitat condition. Okay, so so again, in a lot of these areas where these plants are very abundant, we would like something else there. We have that area that's dominated by those plants, and we say, boy, we'd really like to have that be all native plants.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a challenge, making that conversion. And so before you remove plants, before you remove any plants, it's important to recognize that all plants have habitat value. And in some landscapes, those invasive plants are the only fruit particularly, that might be available, like from now and until the winter. And if you go in there and just remove those plants without making at the same time, make some sort of plan for, all right, how do I replace those with other plants that are providing that function? You can reduce habitat value of those areas just as frequently as you can increase it. And so, and in many landscapes now, where I have so many deer, sometimes those invasive plants are the only plants that are able to grow because the deer eat all of the native plants out. So again, doing that assessment first is really important in making good decisions. How you get rid of buckthorn, that's a whole nother issue.
Yeah, we're doing the experiment right now
Right.
in our meadow. That'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Is there a chemical in swallowwort that kills monarch caterpillars? The person who wrote that understands that's harmful.
Yeah, I'm going to pass that question to Alina.
Yeah. So yes, swallowwort is quite toxic to the monarchs. And so since it is related, the monarchs are able to kind of find it, they lay their eggs on it. And the really unfortunate part is that 100% of those eggs do not become viable caterpillars or monarchs. So it's almost this trap crop of this non-native species that tricks the monarchs into laying their eggs there. And so, yeah, out of all of the ones, I'm pretty passionate about removing the swallowwort. And the time to do that is, well, anytime really, but in the spring is when I think it's most obvious. Matt, would you agree with that?
I would call you for that recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah, spring is when I've seen it be most obvious and have eradication efforts. And then you will see it, it's called swallowwort because it will wind around even shrubs and kind of swallow them out. And then most people are pretty familiar with the larger milkweed pods, but they have kind of like some smaller pods that are quite milkweed looking. So if you do see those and it's a vine, it's probably swallowwort. And yeah, it's black swallowwort is the one that's around here. And for those of you who don't already have it, I highly encourage you to put Seek on your phone or iNaturalist, so that if you're out there and you're trying to understand what's happening, you can scan it or take a photo, and may not be the perfect identification, but it'll get you close to it. And then follow up with one of our panelists here today, and thank you for being in really good shape.
All right, we have gotten into the panel discussion because I don't know who to throw these questions to. So our next question I'm going to toss out there is, over a couple of years, tall stemmy plants have started choking out other species, I guess in this person's property. Can a mow and double till, then reseeding kind of reset the pollinator meadow?
Well, I guess I would ask that person, are these woody stems or are these herbaceous stems? And do we know what type of plant that is? And maybe that's where Seek is going to come into play for you. It's SEEK. If it's it's really going to depend. As we've talked about, some of these non-native, what some people might call invasive plants, if it's one of those, yeah, you want to, it's going to be a much bigger deal than if it is maybe a native plant that is just early successional encroaching. Even something like aspen or what people call poplar, there can be some quite aggressive woodies that are, yeah. So anyways, I'll pass it to the others. I don't know if that person wants to specify.
He did. I was not paying attention. Tall wildflowers, like sunflowers, but smaller. So kind of on the cusp of kind of herbaceous and woody, seems like.
So again, sounds like sunflowers are annual. If you're going fully annual, yeah, maybe mow it down until to kind of have that like shallowly till for kind of a reseeding. But if it were perennial plants, you would treat them very differently. So I guess it just depends what else is in there.
There are some perennial sunflowers that can be, that are native, that can be on the aggressive side because they do spread by rhizomes. My fear, if you're just getting in there and tilling, is that you might be chopping up rhizomes and not actually getting rid of said sunflower. So if this is a limited area, mowing and smothering just that one patch, might work pretty well, or just getting in there with the shovel and digging it up and seeding again. I think it's often necessary, particularly with a small meadow, to rehab parts of it here and there as the years go on, because you may discover over time that you're losing species diversity. A lot of times I'm talking about all these different mixes, but a lot of times what will happen is you'll have a few species that are perfectly adapted to that particular condition where your site is, and you end up with just a whole bunch of just a handful of plants. So getting in there, mowing, digging some stuff up, smothering some patches and seeding again, or putting in some plugs, I think is just, part of the maintenance.
And speaking of maintenance, that's a great segue to our one and only upvoted question. What about maintaining this beautiful meadow that we've created? What are some techniques? Has worked for you all in the past?
The techniques that we recommend is what Marc began to talk about, which is if you have a high mowing situation. So basically, if you have perennial plants, they're spending all their time making their roots in those beginning years, and they're not necessarily having a lot of upward growth. And so during those establishment years, so you've seeded in the fall, the next year, you're going to think about high mowing. And the next year after that, you're going to think about high mowing. So maybe 8 inches in the first year, where you're basically trying to mow off the tops of any sort of annual seed that's coming up. So if it's in a vegetable patch, maybe hairy galansoga, or maybe red root pigweed. It might be crabgrass if it's in the yard. So whatever that is, ideally as those annuals or unwanted weedy species are coming in, you're going to be removing, kind of chopping off their heads before those seeds are viable. And part of chopping that off is those small perennials at this point with their root systems, they now are released. So the canopy has been cut off, and now that understory of these, at this point, not very vigorous natives are released, and they get more sunlight. Later, once they're more established, they are vigorous, but we all are babies at some point.
Thank you. Another question for y'all. Can you seed over existing grass, or is it pretty unlikely to take? I heard from both Alina and Emma, it's like the seed touching the soil is really important. So I wonder about that.
Go for it, Emma.
The turf, so cool season turf grasses that we have in our lawns, most of them are rhizomatous plants that form a really dense cover. You know, if you have a healthy lawn, even if you have a rather unhealthy lawn, you've got a pretty thick mat of vegetation there. And these wildflower seeds that we're talking about are very, very small. We actually have a resource on the extension website that shows what these seeds look like. And they're super, super tiny. And if you sow these plants where you have a dense cover of this, you know, rhizomatous Kentucky bluegrass or something, it's unlikely that that wildflower seed is going to be able to compete with that established grass. And given that you could easily be spending, I don't know, $90 for a quarter pound of seed, it's definitely worthwhile to, you know, spend a whole growing season getting rid of that grass, you know, whether it's through smothering, whether you're repeatedly tilling, even if you're using an herbicide to knock it down, which, you know, is an option, you know, that you can totally use. It's worthwhile making sure you're just down to bare soil and you've suppressed weeds as much as possible so that those perennial wildflowers have a good chance.
Matt, I want to pull you back in.
wholeheartedly-
Okay, thanks, Alina. Matt, what is the value of Oriental bittersweet? And this is kind of loaded. How do you eradicate it?
So again, I guess the habitat value that I can point to, probably the most obvious, you know, habitat value would be the fact that it produces a fruit that stays on into the wintertime. And so in a lot of landscapes, it's often it may be the only fruit that would be available for songbirds and small mammals, you know, into the winter. And that actually, and it's readily eaten. And the fact that in many landscapes, it's the only fruit that's available means that further enhances the potential for that plant to be invasive, because it's the only seed that the critters are eating. And so then all the critters that are eating fruits are then spreading it everywhere. In some areas, you know, other habitat value is cover, nesting sites for, you know, a wide variety of birds that use shrubby edges and ground cover for mammals. But it's definitely a plant that we don't want to encourage, because it is one of the those plants that really does have a great ability to become incredibly invasive and really take over sites. How do you eradicate it? You don't. I mean, and what I mean by that is, you know, when we're talking about dealing with invasive plants, the idea of eradication, which is the complete removal, in most situations is impossible. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a situation where we're reducing that plant enough that native plants or other plants can kind of fill in the gaps that plant does. So how do you go about that? Every site is different. And so in some cases, it might be, in small areas, you could smother it. That can be an effective way. You cut it low, put a tarp over it, for a season or two, and that may be enough to kill that plant. And others, repeated mowing. You want to be careful about mowing it, if it's very big, because if you're blowing the parts of that plant around, it can sprout from its parts. But, establishing a really dense turf cover, herbaceous cover there, and then repeatedly mowing, that can be a good way to keep it down. But in some areas where it's really aggressive, in my experience, the only way to get it, if you really want to get it under control, it would be to use chemicals. And again, to do that, there's, certainly before you go out and buy chemicals for your own property, give a cooperative extension a buzz, or talk to somebody else that's a licensed pesticide applicator, to provide you with some guidance, because you don't want to just go dumping chemicals willy-nilly on your property.
Yeah. Well, folks, I think I'm going to have to close this down. This has been a great evening. We have so many more questions that we can't get to. But if you all want to come and see the project and talk to these experts and some others, we're having an in-person walk around right here at the McLane Center in Concord on November the 20th from 10 a.m. to noon. You can RSVP, it's totally free on the New Hampshire Audubon events webpage, or get into contact with myself or any one of our presenters directly. We're happy to answer your questions. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Diane DeLuca, for organizing all of us and being there in the background and helping out. So we hope to see you at a webinar in the near future and in person on November 20th.
Thanks, everybody, for your interest.
Yes, thank you. See you on the 20th.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care. We'll see ya.